Hi, I'm Linda Sparks, the owner of Farthingale's Corset Making Supplies, and I'm here in the Lasting Impressions photo studio in Stratford. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to make bone casings, and I'm going to demonstrate 10 different types of bone casings that you can use whether you're making corsets or bodices or doublets or fashion. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we'll get started in a minute. First sample of bone casing that we're going to do is a really basic one. It's using your seam allowance. So I've got two pieces of fabric here. There's two of them. And I'm going to stitch them at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's your standard. Now I've used contrasting thread for this just so that you can see. So I've got my top thread in sort of a maroon and the bottom thread is in green. I'm now going to zig, just a narrow zig, along the edge of the seam allowance, so the raw edge. So I'm going to find my zigzag. I'm actually going to just narrow it a little bit. So what I'm using is a broken zigzag. You could also use serging. You could use an overcast. So I've just got something there that's going to inhibit the edge from fraying. I'm just going to trim those. Now I'm going to press this open. I'm just going to finger press it here. You might want to use an iron if you were in your own studio. And now I'm going to stitch right along this edge with a straight stitch. And all I'm doing is I am securing the seam allowance. I'm just securing the seam allowance to the fabric. This is not my usual machine, so I'm having to kind of figure things out as I go here. So I can now slide a bone in between these two seam allowances, and there's the casing. So my bone is secured in the bone casing. It's secured between two layers of coutil right there. I'm not sure if you can see that. So there's two layers before the exterior of the corset. So this would be the wrong side of the corset that faces the body, and that is the exterior of the corset. Alright, we're back, and the second sample that I'm going to do includes bone casing tape, which is actually a tube you can slide the bone into, but we're going to start out very similar to the first sample by sewing the seam. So I'm sewing this at 5/8, but you could sew it at 1/2 inch if that's what you're using. So there we have our seam. I'm just going to line the edge. I'm going to see if you can see that clearly. I'm lining up the edge of my bone casing just inside the edge of the stitching because I don't want 2 rows of stitching on top of each other. putting that underneath. And depending on your machine, you may be able to move your needle quite easily. So that's what we have so far. You can see the original seam stitch. There's the stitch of the bone casing tape, right very close to the edge. And now I have a very dirty piece of fabric, and that's okay. Again, I'm just finger pressing that seam. And I'm going to stitch along the other edge. Now this is a wide bone casing. This is a 1/2 inch wide bone casing, 3/4 inch wide bone casing. So it's wider than usual. If it was narrower than my seam allowance, what I'd have to do is trim that. So I'd have to trim the seam allowance so that it's not sticking out beyond the bone casing tape. But I've chosen wide bone casing tape today just because it's easier to demonstrate on camera. So there's what it looks like when it's done. My stitching isn't great, but it's not bad. And there it is on the outside. So what I can do now is I can slide this into the bone casing. So you see that's a tube. So again, I've got several layers. I've got the coutil and I've got bone casing between the bone and the exterior of the corset, and that's now in there. So I'm just going to talk for a minute about a different foot. If you're not confident in your stitching, there's this foot, and it's got a little tongue underneath, and that tongue can be placed right against the edge of your bone casing tape, and it will keep your stitches nice and evenly distanced from the edge. So considering my stitching today, I probably should have used that. Anyway. The third sample I'm going to do is, again, not a lot different than the first two. We're going to sew the seam, and then I'm going to bind the edge of the seam allowance with bias tape. So I've just cut bias tape in a fashion fabric because it's only binding the seam allowance. It's just binding that raw edge so it won't fray. So it's not, it doesn't have to be particularly strong. So again, I'm stitching at 5/8. Now what I'm going to do is I lay my bias tape with the edges together so that the raw edge of my bias tape is lined up with the raw edge of my seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch it at about 1/8 of an inch. And this is 1.5 inch wide bias tape. I'm just going to finger press it down. And you want bias tape because it will follow any curves in your seams. These seams are quite straight, but in a corset they're often curved. And then I'm folding it over because I'm just wanting to bind that seam allowance. Pressing it. When I turn it over here, if I were to fold it in like that, it does create a bit of bulk. So I tend to fold it and then I just trim it down. Or sometimes I calculate the width of the bias tape I need before I cut the bias tape. So I'm just going to trim that down with my less than great scissors. Then I'm opening my fabric up. I'm finger pressing that seam, taking it back to the machine, and I'm stitching along the edge. If I'd pressed this with an iron, it would definitely have done a much better job, but I don't have an iron in this space. So there we've got our bound edge, which makes it kind of pretty. If my thread matched, it would be quite nice. And I can just slide my bone into the casing. The bone is secured in place. It's a pretty contrast. You might want to use the same fabric as your outer fabric. And there's the other side. Now, being white, you can perhaps see that the dots are showing through. So you might want to take that into consideration. But I tend to use this finish when I'm using a fashion fabric and I make my fashion fabric binding, so you never see it on the outside. So that's it for number 3, and we'll be moving on in a minute. All right, we're back for sample number 4, and this is going to be a double bone casing. So we'll fit 2 bones into the casing, and I'm using again the bone casing tape that I did in the earlier sample. So I'm going to start with sewing down the middle of the bone casing. Now, depending on your machine, you may have to adjust where your needle is landing. Like mine is not quite centered on that foot. So let's hope I've got it right. I'm messing up a bit. So I've basically sewn down the middle of the tape. If you need to draw a line on that tape, go right ahead. I'm now sewing my seam. And for continuity, I am just doing 5/8. And then I'm just lining this up as I did before. And I'm lining the edge of the bone casing tape up with that stitching so that I'm not stitching on top of the previous stitching. I'm stitching just inside the line. So this is making it a really strong seam. I've just lost my foot pedal. Just, there we go. So I've got seam stitch, the stitch securing the bone casing, the stitch dividing the bone casing in half, and again I'm just going to press that, press it, and then I'm stitching down the other side. So there we have double bone casings. And I'm just going to slide this into each one and slide another one in. And we'll see how accurate my stitching was. That worked out fairly well. So there are 2 bones in that. You could use this as an exterior casing if you wanted, but basically it's an interior casing, but it does have 2 bones for a bit of extra support in the bone casing. So that's our double bone casing using bone casing tape, and we'll move on to the next one in a minute. All right, we're back, and now I'm going to demonstrate invisible bone casings. So for invisible bone casings, we do have to have a fashion fabric as our outer layer. So I have my 2 layers of coutil and my 2 layers of fashion fabric. And I'm going to put the fashion fabric, one piece of fashion fabric against one piece of coutil, and then another piece of fashion fabric against another piece of coutil. I'm then putting them right sides together. So that they're all lined up. And I'm going to stitch them as I have the other samples at 5/8 of an inch. And I'll be honest, I'm not being as accurate here as I might be if I was making a corset. But you're going to get the idea. So I've sewn the seam. I'm going to open the seam, and I'm going to press the seam allowance to one side. Now I always press my corset seam allowances to one side. I never press them open. I just find it makes them stronger, less likely to split. And now I'm going to open that side. You can see there's the seam allowance underneath, the layer of coutil, and then the fashion fabric is pushed away from the seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch it right here. I'm going to zig it first, just so that raw edge is not going to fray. Maybe I'll use an overcast. this instance, I did use the overcast stitch. Again, it's just something to keep that edge from fraying. Repress that down. Get the fashion fabric out of the way so that when I stitch the seam allowance down, I'm only stitching it to the coutil. And now I can just straight stitch. So there's my straight stitch. I like to keep it nice and close to the edge so that this edge does not flip up. There's it stitched to the coutil on the wrong side. And when I put the fashion fabric back in place, you have an invisible bone casing. So that keeps it nice and neat on the outside. If you're doing a bodice or a fashion item, you may not want it to be obvious that there are bones in it, and this gives you that. So invisible bone casing on the right side, but you can see it on the wrong side. I'll just slide a bone in there. And again, you've got lots of fabric between your bone and the exterior of the garment. So you're not going to risk having that bone work a hole out and end up coming out of your bodice or your corset. But there's that. All right, we'll be moving on to the next one. Next bone casing sample is what I call the sandwich method. So it's just 2 pieces of coutil. And I'm just going to draw a line on here. If you feel you can sew a straight line, as many people can, then you could just sort of mark start and finish. You could use disappearing ink, whatever. So I'm putting that on here. Making sure I'm on straight stitch. Stitched one line, and now I'm going to stitch a line parallel to it. I'm actually moving my needle as far away as possible. And there I have my bone casing. And I will just slide a bone in that. So you're going to adjust this depending on the width of your bone. But there my bone is sliding right through. So I've got a bone casing between 2 layers of coutil. And you may decide that, you know, you're making a coutil corset with 2 layers of coutil so that it's really strong. And these would be your mid-panel bones, just in between the seams. So this is not on a seam, it's in between the seam. And therefore we can sandwich it between the 2 layers of coutil. Do not sandwich it between a layer of coutil and a layer of fashion fabric, because the fashion fabric won't be strong enough, but it's strong enough if you're using 2 layers of coutil. Our next bone casing sample is another one that is sort of the sandwich technique and is using 2 layers of coutil and is a mid-panel bone casing. So I have my 2 sheets of coutil here, 2 pieces of coutil. I'm going to place a bone casing on the wrong side of the coutil. I'm going to stitch it down. in the wrong spot here, which happens. So I'm not sure if you can see, but there is a little groove here, and there's a little groove here. My stitching needs to be between the groove and the edge, or between the groove and the edge. If it's in this section, then it's in the channel where the bone would go. So we don't want our stitching within the channel that the bone is supposed to fit, because then there won't be room for it. And maybe just while I'm doing this, I will swap out feet. So that I've got that foot with the tongue on it. And I'm not sure if you can get in and see this, that there's a little tongue there or not. But the tongue is right against the edge of the bone casing tape. And while I know some people don't like to sew their bone casings in two different directions like this, I've never had a problem doing it. It's faster, and if you're using the foot with a tongue, you don't have a choice. So there is a mid-panel bone casing using bone casing tape. There's the other side. We can slide a bone into it like that. Lots of room for that wide bone. And at this point, we can take the other layer of coutil, place it over top, and then treat it as one piece. So again, I'm going to switch that foot out. I'm just going to sew across one end to secure the two pieces together. So basically, it's another invisible bone casing, pretty much. The bone goes into the casing. The casing is not really visible except for some shading, but on the other side it is. And again, you could sew down this bone casing tape through the middle and put two narrower bones in it. This is the 3/4 inch or 20 millimeter wide bone casing. And there's the inside, the outside. So that's it. It's pretty easy. They're all sort of a variation of the first one. We're doing inseam bone casings and mid-panel bone casings, and really they're all one variation of another. Alright, we're going to do another mid-panel bone casing, and this one's going to be curved. So it's a little bit different. Normally I would use coutil, and I would cut it on the bias and make my bias bindings for these bone casings out of coutil. But today I've used fashion fabric so that it's more visible than it would otherwise be. So this is a piece of fashion fabric that I have simply made into bias tape. I've cut it on the bias, I've folded the edges, I've pressed it, and I'm just going to do a curve, just a little curve. I'm going to sew it into place, but bias will curve where the bone casing tape will not. So I'm just doing a random curve here. If I was going to do a more dramatic curve, I would take it to the iron and I would press the curved shape into it. So I didn't stitch that very well, but it is what it is. And again, it's a good reason to stitch with a thread that matches your fabric. And if I had pressed this into shape first, it will make it much easier. And if I was sewing with pins, it would probably make it much easier as well. It's just not something I've ever really done. I can cut the extra off. I'll just cut the extra off. Get rid of that. So we've got a curved bone casing with bad stitching. And then I'm going to take a spiral bone, which can curve. So there we have it. We've got a bone casing that's curved with a spiral bone in it, and it's holding that bone in shape. Curved bone casing, middle of the panel with a spiral bone. And with this one you do absolutely have to use that spiral bone as opposed to the white bone. The white bone would never be able to make that curve. There we have it. I'm going to now talk about a curved bone casing in the sandwich method. So I've got 2 layers of coutil. I could draw a curved line on this, or I can just wing it, which is what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to start here. So there's a curved line. Now the interesting thing is I've got to stitch another line parallel to the first line and equidistant from it. So I'm going to measure first the width of my bone so that I know I'm going to be able to fit that. So there's my bone, and I want to make sure that there's room in that casing for the thickness of my bone, not just the width, but the thickness, what's there. So I have to add a little bit of ease to this amount. So I'm going to set my machine up. And it looks like it'll be okay. Obviously I have to stitch much slower this time. there's my curved lines, 2 pieces of coutil, and there's the bone sliding into it. So whether you need it for support, whether you want it as a design feature, it works both ways. That spiral bone fit into that casing in order to make a curved casing, mid-panel, sandwich method using just 2 layers of coutil. Make sure it's 2 layers of coutil, not a layer of fashion fabric and a layer of coutil, because it needs to be something strong to keep that bone in place and from rubbing holes through the fabric. So that's something important to remember. But there we have it. Wrong side, right side, spiral bone. Okay, we're going to move on to something a little bit different in this bone casing, because it's not a casing. It's a woven bone, and I'm sewing it to the fabric in order to secure it in place, as opposed to sliding it into a casing. So what woven boning is sometimes it's called rigoline or rigoline. It's got little, it's woven, there's threads going across the weft, and then there are little prickly bits, pieces of plastic. And there are tips for these. They're little rubber tips. They have a hole in them. You can see that hole against the white. They slide onto the end so that the ends are blunted, because otherwise these ends can fray. So when I'm going to secure this, I'm placing it on my fabric. I'm placing it under the sewing machine. I'm using, I prefer a broken zigzag to a zigzag, and these bones only go straight. And then I'm just going to lift that foot and move it forward a little bit. As I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that zigzag should probably be a little bit wider. Just to go from edge to edge. And as I get to the end to go over that bone, I just sort of lift it, go a little bit further, because otherwise the rubber bone gets caught. So it's hard to see there because that is the purple thread is on the black, but there's the broken stitch on the back, and it is securing that bone in place, and it's giving a little bit more substance. Now, you may have noticed that these bones are curved. So when these are curved, the first one I sewed on with the curve going downwards. The second one I'm going to sew with the curve going upwards. So I'm always going to use 2 of these side by side in order to balance that curve and give a bit more support, because these are not nearly as strong as the steel bones or even German plastic or synthetic whalebone. So I'm just going to go ahead, and you might be able to see that that's a little bit curved there just with the bone on it. So this bone is going to be sewn in the opposite direction. And I haven't put tips on this. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do sort of a satin stitch zigzag at the top. And I'm going to make it tighter. And I'm just going to show that to you so you can see that. So what I've done is I've done a very close stitch. Would have been great if it was wider, but my machine doesn't want to go any wider. But that does sort of secure that end, and I could go even closer. Then I go back to my broken stitch and my broken zigzag. Jammed. So let's just, and this is the kind of thing that happens to everyone at some point. So it's like, don't get worried about it. Everything can be fixed. Let's go back there. And then I'm just going to do that satin stitch again. So I'm making the zigzag as wide as possible, and I am shortening the stitch length. So there is one with the tip, one with the tip, and one without the tip. And so you can see why I prefer to have the rubber tip on here, because it just does a nice finish to the end. There's no chance of it fraying. It's a nice soft end. It's not going to prickle you. But there it is. Rubber end, not rubber end. The fact that my stitching wouldn't go the full width of the boning in this case isn't a problem when I'm using the rubber tips. They just sort of make a nice finish, and if you feel it, it feels so much nicer than the raw edges. And I'm not sure if you can tell, but that piece is no longer curved. So because we've curved them two different ways, they're flattening each other out. So we now have a nice flat piece of fabric. And we've got two pieces of bones, woven boning, in the middle of the panel, creating a decent amount of support, but certainly not what you might want for a corset. There's a term, last but not least. In this case, this is the last sample, and it is also the least. It's the least used, it's the least commonly known about, and really I have used it extremely rarely. But it's good to know. I have here 3 pieces of fabric. I have my coutil, which is the layer that would be against the skin. I have a silk, just a piece of silk as my outer layer. I have a piece of what's called lamb's wool. Even though it's no longer made of lamb's wool, it's called lamb's wool. And what the lamb's wool does is it buffers the outer fabric when it's something fine like this silk from showing the bones, either the dimension of the bones or the shading of the bones. So I'm going to start much like I've done the other ones. I'm going to stitch a piece of casing to my coutil. I'm getting lazy. So there's my bone casing sewn to my coutil. Just going to trim those threads. I'm then going to take my fleece, my lamb's wool, place it over top, and take my piece of coutil silk. So there you can see that even if we were using a white bone casing tape, it would probably be visible. And you would see, because this is a fine fabric, you would see ridges once this was pressed or pulled tight against the body. You would see the ridges of that. Even if you do it on the other side and your threads are matching, you might still see something. So here we're leaving a nice smooth finish against the body. The bone casing is here. Lay the fleece over it so that your fashion fabric is over the top. So you're going to treat the fashion fabric, the fleece and the coutil, sort of as one, and then you would do your fashion fabric, which is a little hard to set up here. It's a little bit stretchy. I do not tend to stretch it out. Lay that on top. Pick it up. So you can't really see the effects of the boning. And when that's pulled tight, you won't get those ridges that you could get otherwise by just having the bone casing under such a fine fabric. So you're not going to use this very often. It is the least used, but it's good to know about. And that is the last of the bone casing samples that I'm going to discuss today. So that concludes today's class.